G'day everybody, thanks for joining us. We've got Keith Wiley here today, who's a board member of Carbon Copies and has written extensively on the concepts of mind uploading and whole brain emulation. He's the author of A Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading, as well as the author of a new book which is coming out very soon, which is a novel this time, a fiction, Contemplating Oblivion, which should be coming out sometime this month. So welcome, and it's great to have you here again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be back.
Now, I guess mind uploading has a concept that's been kicked around for a while now. Why don't you think that mind uploading has enjoyed as much wide acceptance within the philosophical community, within the philosophy community, as it has in the futurist community?
Well, I guess I don't know exactly why people are answering questions the way they do, because they tend to be rather terse interviews that don't really have a lot of follow-up. But I think that the sort of really contentious questions of the debate right around this whole body identity concern and the copy problem, which I actually consider to be a category error, are really hard to get away from. And in fact, I think the recent popularity of the discussion has probably made people think about it just enough to convince themselves that it doesn't work, but not to really think past that point. So there is a certain sort of initial reaction, I think, where you're presented with the idea of a non-destructive uploading scenario. It could be a transporter-like scenario from Star Trek, or just a more sort of direct mind uploading scenario. But if it's presented in a non-destructive fashion and people think about it for a minute, they sort of initially have this gut reaction that something about it must not have worked because of the famous copy problem. And the bulk of my writing has been an attempt to chip away at that sort of instinctive reasoning and really work through it beyond an intuitive sort of feeling and see where a logical analysis really lands. So there are these various reasons that support the initial intuition. People often raise concerns about breaking the stream of consciousness, or good old-fashioned body identity, in which sort of they feel like their identity has to stick to their atoms, or what I call space-time worm identity, which sort of says that it seems a little odd that your identity might discontinuously jump around in space. You have to sort of go past the quick off-the-cuff reaction to sort of ask whether that actually makes any sense. And I personally have always landed pretty squarely on the psychological model of identity, which is memory-based. Identity is indicated by some unique conglomeration of a lifetime of memories. And just to be clear, I use the word memory in a broader sense than what most people might think. I don't just mean episodic memories of events from your life. For me, the word memory means the totality of neural encodings in the brain. So there's a lot of subconscious personality traits. There's actually a lot of muscle memory. Sort of the ability to play the piano is a memory, even though it's a completely subconscious memory stored primarily in the cerebellum, presumably. So by memory, I just mean neural encodings within the brain. But nevertheless, my preferred model of identity pins identity to that feature, and that leads one towards certain conclusions. First of all, that uploading works because it's all memory-based. So if you consider a thought experiment in which those memories remain intact through the uploading procedure, then by definition it worked, because that was the premise. And in order to reject that, you have to sort of figure out why you reject it. You're obviously going to reject it on the basis of some not full commitment to the memory basis of identity. You're looking at some other component. And I just don't do that. I just always found that the psychological and memory theory works best.
Okay. So, I mean, it's interesting that, if it's totally based on memory, surely you'd have to have some sort of mechanism to be able to process consciousness, valence, awareness, and the memory as well, in order to have an agent feel as though it's got some sort of stream of or persistence of identity, an enduring metaphysical ego.
Yes, there is this. Right, so you've got the concept of identity and you've got the concept of consciousness, and they're not necessarily the same thing,
No.
which is where the famous thought experiments of philosophical zombies come from. You could have agents, cognitively processing in the world, and encoding memories of a form. Although it's hard to imagine what reflecting on a memory consists of if you have no consciousness. I'm not quite sure what that comes down to, but nevertheless, you can sort of separate these components, and you can ask, what would it be like to be an unconscious but yet memory fulfilling system? I think it's mostly philosophical whimsy. I don't actually think that philosophical zombies are a practical reality. They're just sort of a philosophical exploration.
Well, David Chalmers brought up the thought experiment as if you had an atom for atom reconstruction of a human, the first human had consciousness and the second human didn't have consciousness, although all their atoms and physically they were exactly the same. Wouldn't that imply dualism? So, but I mean, people take the thought experiment to mean something else, and it's been used to describe artificial intelligence without the architecture or the phenomenology of consciousness as well. So
we're this interview is evolving quickly. We're getting into some other topics, but yes, there is this.
Sorry about that.
There's a huge question in the last 3 years, give or take, what the implications are of the huge LLM models. What does that actually have to say, not only about artificial intelligence, but also about consciousness? Are these things conscious? Do they actually have a sentient sort of set of rights and things like that? A lot of people, I think, with pretty good reason, think that the LLMs are not satisfying those requirements. They're doing something else, but they're probably not conscious in the way that we're particularly concerned about. I don't think that they have a lot of recurrent wiring in their layers. They tend to be pretty feed forward heavy. And there's, I'm definitely one of those people who thinks that recurrence is doing something. We don't quite know what, but I think recurrence is a crucial component of consciousness in some fashion. Sort of sense of kind of looking back on itself in a sort of a loop of sort of experiential self-learned looking. We don't know metaphysically, like, why, what is it about that's critical to consciousness? But a lot of people seem to agree that some kind of recurrence should be part of the design. Short of that, something that's always bothered me about the modern AI systems is that they're all sort of on and off, and then they're in the dark. You query them with your question. They go off and they dig through their neural net. They come up with a result, and they produce for you a paragraph of text or an image or a digitized voice, and then they go dark. That's it. Like they're not sitting there daydreaming. They're not musing on the conversation you're having with them, going back over the previous dialogue from last minute. They're not doing any. They're dead. While the prompt sits there blinking until you issue your next query. So, can a system like that be conscious? Is an interesting question. And are these systems conscious on the basis of that sort of strange operation, which is just very not lifelike? It's just not what we think of. It's not what we do with people. A person doesn't sort of sit there like a rock until you go up to them and sort of you query them, and then they do something and they emit, and then they die until you interact with them again. Like, people don't work that way. Animals don't work that way. So natural brains seem to be in a constant flux. That's what it means to be a dynamic living brain, and modern AI systems don't do that. By definition, that's just not what they do. So I don't think they're conscious. I think it's pretty clear that they're lacking these major features that we would generally assume we expect before we're going to put those labels on it. I don't know.
Yeah, what a time to be alive, where we beginning to be able to I guess, empirically investigate some of these questions in more with more precision, and also with a whole lot more data, and we can test assumptions in artificial sort of substrates instead of just try and probe directly the human mind. Not averse to doing the latter though. I think it's really interesting where brain computer interfaces could go. But given the so what kind of resolution or fidelity of memory do you think is required for persistence in order to either reconstitute or persist an identity or a sense of
Yeah.
self?
Um, I'm
How
not a
do we
professional.
approach that question?
Yeah.
Really, it maybe is a
Well,
better question.
I think the first approach is to bring in the professionals, of which I am not. I think that there are, psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists probably have, there's probably a lot of very established science in sort of how memory evolves over the course of one's life, and what degrees of memory loss imply, sort of noticeable losses of personality or sort of the external third party perception that a person is sort of being lost over the course of dementia. We can say, if you lose your memory at a certain slow, steady rate, it's not dementia and you're not really losing your personality. But if it happens faster or if it happens more discontinuously, then we as external observers sort of recognize that there's some sort of identity collapse sort of in process. So I don't claim to, be holding the professional sort of state of that. But it's something like that. It certainly can't be a requirement of perfect fidelity because this is Thomas Reid's experiment from the 1700s that people are, over the course of their lives, always constantly, steadily shedding their old memories, and yet we consider it to be a persistence of identity so long as the shift is, smooth below some threshold. Um, but to give you an actual answer to that question, I don't know.
Hmm.
I suspect
Yeah.
I do think it does imply though that when we try to create mind uploads, and things of that nature, there's going to be a lot of wiggle room. People
Mm.
who demand that before a mind upload can be bona fide, it has to preserve every quantum state in the brain or some complete nonsense like that are, I just think they're off the map. I mean, it can't possibly require anywhere near that level of fidelity for us to judge the result to be a successful preservation of identity. That's just ridiculous.
Hmm.
But again, I don't actually know what the threshold is going to be, but I think we're going to have a lot of leeway. I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility once we figure out how to do this.
Right, and previously in an interview in the past, you've mentioned the idea of a child had drowned in very very cold waters underneath ice or something like that, and in upwards of an hour after drowning or
Um,
being out of it for an hour, they've been able to be revitalized.
right.
Yeah, so.
So this cuts to a very specific argument.
Hmm.
A common argument that comes up in uh, debates about whether or not a mind upload preserves your identity is a concern that people have about whether or not it preserves your stream of consciousness. There is this perception that you have this um, permanent, lifelong, never ending, ongoing, dynamic stream of processing. And if that breaks and restarts, such as you go into some sort of, mind uploading operation and your entire brain is vaporized, but it's scanned in the process and then it's revitalized in a whole brain emulation, a computational model, that breakage marks a loss of identity. The person dies by definition, and then a new doppelganger basically springs up out of the ether and takes their place. So that's the basis of that argument. And I've written not one, but in fact two papers on this specific question. They have very similar titles, but I don't know. I think they're both worth reading. But um, there is a proof positive argument that whole line of reasoning doesn't work. Um, so the way a sort of an exploratory debate will usually approach this is like, Well, when you fall asleep, you sort of lose a little bit of consciousness. Does that break your stream of identity? And then you say, yeah, but you still got a lot of neural processing going on, so that doesn't count. Okay,
Hmm.
well, you go into the ER and you go under general anesthesia. That's really deep. That's really, that's really turning the brain down a lot. Maybe, does that undo the argument? They say, well, no, even in general anesthesia, you still got a lot of neural processing going on. So no, that doesn't count. Like, there's just sort of a lot of knockdown arguments here that you're trying to sort of work your way through. And eventually you get to the fact that there are real world medical cases of people under two different scenarios, one accidental and one intentional, sort of an OR procedure, um, that basically disprove this whole thing. So there is this accident or tragedy, usually called rapid frigid drowning. It's occurred a few times. It either occurs when someone falls into a frozen lake, or occasionally in a dry example, they just fall into a snowdrift. Essentially, these are sort of real medical cases that have come up. And they are found several hours later, 8 hours later. Um, and in a few, in most cases like this, the person dies. um, in a few rare medical cases, they dropped in temperature quickly enough that instead of killing them, it essentially preserved them, the same way a freezer preserves food from spoiling. um, and in a few rare medical cases, those people have been miraculously brought to an emergency room, and they basically shot from the hip. It's not like this happens often enough that they know what to do, but the doctors basically went through the motions of trying to slowly warm a person up so that they don't go into shock and various things of that nature. And there have been cases of recoveries. Okay, what's the point of all this? The point is, well, first of all, the point is not that their bodies and their brains froze solid. That this is not an example of sort of natural accidental. And so that was the accidental case. Then there's an OR procedure called hypothermic preservation. I can't remember exactly what the term is. It's usually used for cardiac surgeries. It's not used for neural surgery. It's used for cardiac surgery. You take the patient's brain down in temperature in order to buy more time to perform the cardiac surgery. While you're working on the heart, you're not pumping blood through the rest of the body, including the brain. You take the brain down in temperature on purpose so that the brain will survive longer, hopefully long enough to finish a heart surgery. Okay, so those are the two cases. So then coming back to my point, sometimes people sort of over-interpret this. They're like, oh, this is an example of cryonics. We know cryonics works. That's actually not true. In none of these realized medical cases did the person remain in a cold environment long enough to literally freeze. That's not what these medical cases involve. But they do involve a drop in temperature to, okay, the temperatures are in those papers that I wrote. So go to them for the exact numbers. I don't remember. But somewhere on the order of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. So they're well above freezing. But the point is that there is a temperature below which the brain does not operate anymore. It does not fire action potentials between neurons anymore. Neurons do not operate just because they're above freezing or something. There's a critical temperature at which they are able to operationalize being a neuron, primarily operationalizing action potentials, which is the fundamental basis of all sort of neurology theory. The propagation of action potentials is how we expect the brain works. And that temperature is higher than some of these medical cases. So just that I'm speaking in sort of long interwoven sentences here. What it comes down to is there are medical cases where a patient has had a brain not fire any action potentials for many, many hours, which, coming back to the original point, means that their stream of consciousness was turned off like a water tap. You cannot have a stream of consciousness if you don't have a brain sending signals, through itself from one neuron to the next. There's no stream of consciousness if the brain is not processing. So these are patients whose stream of consciousness ceased. And when they were revived, nobody called them a copy or a doppelganger or a body snatcher or whatever these ridiculous, everyone just treated them as a revived, recovered medical patient. Um, and that's it. That's the disproof of the entire stream of consciousness counter argument against, preservation of identity via mind uploading, on the basis of it sort of involving some cessation of processing during the uploading procedure. It's just that's the whole thing. Um, I think the paper's going into a little more detail, but really I don't think there's a whole lot more there. So that's you sort of brought that up, and I just thought I would kind of walk through that. That's what that was all about.
Is whole brain emulation needed for mind uploading?
Right. Um, I think whole brain emulation, short answer, yes. I mean, I don't really see how you do it without it. There are some interpretations of mind uploading that sort of lean away from that. There's this concept of um, training what did they used to be called classically? They were called expert systems. This is what they were called in the 80s and 90s. These expert systems, which have basically now become bots and the recent LLMs and the AIs. If you train one of these things on the corpus of a person's available lifetime of media, some people provide more media than others, but everything they wrote, all their emails, any videos, home videos, everything you can find that person ever produced. If you train one of these neural net AI systems that are sort of all the buzz these days against that, you can produce a bot that basically in a dialogue acts a lot like that person. So the theory, and there have been companies that have made an entire business model around sort of ostensibly preserving you in this way, or at least preserving like this a sort of post-mortem puppet for other people to interact with. So the idea is, you produce the system, and in those cases where there's a rich enough set of data, you could produce a bot that sort of passes for the person. And would that count as mind uploading? So that's a version of mind uploading that doesn't involve whole brain emulation. But there aren't too many examples like that. In most cases, mind uploading is a whole brain emulation concept. And the way I describe it is that whole brain emulation is just a technical term. It's the process of modeling and emulating the neural processing of a brain. Doing that is whole brain emulation. Mind uploading is not actually a technical term. Mind uploading, the way I see it is a philosophical interpretation of the consequences of whole brain emulation. If you choose to interpret whole brain emulation as a preservation of a person, a preservation of a person's identity, then the label for that is mind uploading. Mind uploading is the interpretation of whole brain emulation as a preservation of identity. You have uploaded the mind. I don't actually hear too many people phrase it that way, but that's sort of, I've always thought of mind uploading as just being this interpretation of the technical process of whole brain emulation.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess the question comes to me is, do you think you'd need to upload all the exact brain of a particular identity in order to reproduce that identity in the machine? Or are there some parts of the brain that are rather generic that you'd be able to scaffold on more templated emulations of like a generic brain? Are there certain salient features of the brain which are more important to preserve personal identity and enduring metaphysical ego?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's one really big one, which is that something like 80% of our brain by neuron count is the cerebellum, and you could probably just throw the whole thing away. You might, not bring your expert piano playing skills along with you. And you might, because the muscle memory is often encoded in the cerebellum, and whether or not
you could borrow someone else's,
or you could relearn it again, right? But if you're trying to sort of simplify the process of the emulation, because if it turned out to be technically really hard, you're trying to find ways to cut corners. It's sort of debatable whether a professional musician, or it could be a professional athlete, think of some sort of muscle memory task, would they consider that to be a critical component of their identity? If they lost that, would they not be the same person? That's a very sort of emotional question to ask. But nevertheless, it really doesn't impact the cortical, and by which I mean cortex, the cortex encodings that we generally associate with all the rest of personality traits. All of that is in the cortex, not the cerebellum, not the thalamus, maybe the hypothalamus, because that's doing some short-term memory work, not the amygdala. There's all sorts of stuff in there that doesn't seem to be particularly pertinent to what we consider to be human identity, which isn't too surprising because if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, the human cortex and neocortex is just this 500,000 year veneer, sort of thinly layered on top of 4 billion years of stuff that we don't care about. We don't care about the aspects of our identity back when we were amphibians. So why would we consider that important? What we really are interested in is just the last 500,000 years of neurological evolution. That's the stuff we really need to successfully carry over to preserve human identity. Now, I'm not saying we have to just sort of cut it off that early. It might be nice to try to get a richer, more complete emulation. I'm not against that. But the question is it possible to achieve, a pretty good passing whole brain emulation and mind upload, at some fraction of the total brain? And I think we could. I think we could make a good enough version 1 with way less than the entire brain. And over time, we'll probably be able to do the rest of it anyway. So it's probably going to be a moot question 10 years later. But in theory, I don't think we need a lot of it.
Okay, so therefore, if we don't need to emulate the whole brain, then are we approaching the compute required to be able to achieve this if we knew how, do you think?
So there are very wide estimates. There are different sort of dimensions. Processing power, memory capacity. I think in a recent video or presentation, sort of the speed of communications between the units was considered. I think the expectation is that we have almost gotten there now with some of our supercomputers, at least at the lower estimates of human processing capability. But this sort of begs the question of whether mere number of computes per second is actually the trick. Or, I'm a big believer in neuromorphic computing, in which you actually create a massively parallel system that is connected to itself and wired against itself in ways that closely mirror the architecture of the brain. And one might ask, well, who cares? And this comes back to a point made earlier, which is that I strongly suspect there is something about the recurrent self-referential, self-looping signal processing structure of the brain that is important. I don't know why. This is an open question. We don't understand consciousness well enough to understand why certain network architectures seem to work and others don't. So the wiring diagrams in the cerebellum have essentially nothing to do with your consciousness. If you remove a person's cerebellum in surgery, their consciousness, their sense of who they are, is all left completely intact. Again, there can be sort of some damage to their muscle memory, but their sense of who they are is not harmed, and their sort of their conscious experience is not affected. So the way that the cerebellum is wired is not the right way, and the way the cortex is wired is the right way. What is that way? We don't know. It's the 21st century. What a time to be alive. I don't know, but I think that we need to get. I think we need to solve that. I think we need to figure that out. We need to figure out what it is about the wiring of the cortex that is creating this amazing experience, and that's what we need to make sure that we recapture in an emulation.
Do people know what parts of the brain were destroyed when Phineas Gage got a big rod for his brain?
They definitely do. I don't recall off the top of my head. So it went sort of right behind his eye, which means that it hit a lot of his prefrontal cortex, which is really the creme de la creme. It hit parts of the brain that are salient to sort of emotion control or something, which is why after the accident he became very sort of fly off the handle, kind of sort of an angry kind of person. He just sort of didn't regulate his emotions properly. So something about that sort of and it wasn't like an amygdala, sort of emotional response. My understanding, really have to go read it. I'm sort of shooting from the hip here, but my understanding is that our very advanced intellectual cortex level ability to regulate our emotions, to basically just think through a situation instead of flying off the handle. That's all, that's not the kind of carefully reasoned stuff that, say, a mouse does. A mouse more or less does actually kind of respond emotionally to what happens around it. Humans can feel the emotions, but also think through it and say, okay, I'm not going to act directly in accordance with my emotions. I'm going to act in this intellectually rationalized way instead, because I have a cortex that enables me to do that. And that's precisely what got blasted out of Cage's head. But no, I don't remember exactly which. I mean, if you look it up, it'll tell you exactly which parts of his brain were damaged.
Do you think quantum computing is required for whole brain emulation or mind uploading, or if it's not, could it be desirable?
Yeah. So, of course, Penrose and Hanneroff made this famous. I mean,
Microtubular.
the most honest answer is that I don't know. Of course, people tend to have hunches, and I have a hunch.
What's your hunch?
I I would be surprised if the quantum mechanical properties of neurons had anything to do with sort of animalian evolved behavior. Why would evolution need to go there? It seems like all it really needs to do is get the action potentials sputtering around well enough that the animal can satisfy the four F's of survival. Why do you need quantum mechanics to do that? Like I don't see the need. Um, I don't get it. I've just never found the quantum mechanical argument for consciousness convincing. Um, that's my take. But I'm also fairly open-minded about it. There's a lot we don't understand about quantum mechanics. There's a lot we don't understand about consciousness. Some people see that as an excuse to pin them together implicitly. People like Deepak Chopra are like, well, we don't understand consciousness and we don't understand quantum mechanics. That means they're connected, right? So that's garbage reasoning, right? Two things aren't related just because they're both mysterious. But at the same time, they are both mysterious. We don't actually know. So I'm open to someday discovering that there's a connection there. But I don't see a need for it now. Forgive the cat.
The cat is forgiven.
Yeah.
Once we can upload brains onto a computer, there's going to be an economic issue too about how to afford to do all this and how to do it in a cost-effective way, such there's a good ratio between the amount of minds that can be uploaded and the amount of power which is consumed. I guess that the trade-offs will become more friendly over time as technology gets better. But what's the role of the type of resolution that we might want to capture and the ability to do compression to reduce the amount of space a mind might
Yeah.
occupy?
I do have some numerical answers to that question, but more to the point, everyone's sort of used to these, claims about the rate of advance of technology, and it's true. So, we can just barely scrape together a supercomputer that might emulate the human brain today. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars, and it'll only run one brain. And it's not wired correctly to do that anyway, so we couldn't do it even if we wanted to, but in theory, the architecture's there. So we're just, that's where we are now. Somewhere down the road, we'll be able to do it expensively but successfully. And then 10 years after that, we'll be able to do it cheaply. The human brain uses as much electricity as a light bulb. So we're going to get it, at some point, the power requirements won't be relevant. It's not like you're going to need a supercomputer or even anything as inefficient as a desktop computer. You'll need something as efficient as a brain. And, how cheap are brains? There are brains everywhere. Like, brains don't take much energy. The world's full of brains. So once we are able to create those kinds of computers at that level of energy efficiency, the efficiency equation and therefore the cost equation is all just going to go out the window. So long as your brain, as long as your emulated brain can get as much energy as a salad, then it'll be able to stay alive the same way we can, right? So it's just that whole problem's going to go away. I hate to say that it's a question of patience, but it is. People really chomp at the bit about futurism stuff sometimes. They're really like, gosh, this stuff really needs to happen in the 2040s or it's no good at all. I mean, I'm sorry, but some stuff's just not going to be available in the 2040s, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, early in the next century, or later in the next century. I don't know when, but I'm not particularly concerned about that because when it does happen, I just think it's going to be practically preordained. I don't think it can be stopped. I also don't think it can really be expedited too much. I mean, mostly we want to create a society and a culture that sort of broadly favors science and knowledge and openness, and sort of inquisitiveness and curiosity. If we just sort of create a society that creates and supports these general ideas, the science will just happen. Now, I can get into some minor specifics. You were talking about sort of resolution and compression and things like that. So where we currently stand on sort of producing whole brain emulations is, well, in short, we can't, but there's sort of multiple steps in the process. So the most likely way to produce a whole brain emulation is to preserve the brain. That means essentially embed it in resin, and then you deli slice it, and then you take pictures of each slice. You can't use like a camera because the neurological features you're trying to capture are smaller than the wavelengths of visible light. You can't take a picture of something that's smaller than a wavelength of light. So we use electron microscopy to do this. And the resolution that we're currently able to achieve is a z-axis resolution. That means slice to slice. We can physically diamond knife slice brains at about a 40 nanometer thick resolution. And then when we take an electron microscope image of a slice, we can achieve about a 4 nanometer XY resolution. So each image has 10 times as much resolution, 10 times the fineness of resolution as the slice to slice steps. So in the 3 dimensions, 2 of the dimensions are finer by a factor of 10 than the third. And the question is that good enough? And the answer is, according to current models and theories of how the brain works, the major paradigm of action potentials propagating along axons, triggering synapses, and then propagating secondary action potentials in downstream neurons, we can image synapses at that resolution. And of course, we can image all the rest of the neural components, which are larger than the synapses. So we can actually capture the necessary resolution to produce a whole brain emulation. We can do it today. What we can't capture is the scale. So the data sets that we are scanning these days are, what sort of cubic section of a brain can we kind of scoop up and actually perform this on? And it's on the order of sort of fractions of a cubic millimeter. 1 full millimeter is just, sort of coming around the bend as sort of a 2020s project. So, human brain is a little bit bigger than that. So we've got a ways to go. I think a whole mouse brain of approximately a cubic centimeter, which is 1,000 times bigger than a millimeter, is one of the projects that is being sort of put together now to be achieved over the next many years. And when that is done, all we will have is a brain of a mouse. All we will have is 1 centimeter. We're going to need to go another factor of 10 in all 3 directions to get to the human. So it's going to take a while. But the interesting thing is that while it's going to take a while on the calendar to get there's very little that actually appears to stand in the way. We just need to keep turning the crank for a few decades. And there's no real obvious like place where we think it's just technically like we're up against a wall. When we look at it today, there are things that we don't know how to do yet. Getting the perfusion of the chemicals deep into a large brain evenly is very hard to do. We don't really know exactly how to do it. How do we can slice up a slice of a brain on the scale of microns, but can we create, a cross section of a brain that's only 40 nanometers thick, but is 5 inches across, right? Like, how do you even handle that, right? So there are major technical questions, but these don't feel like things are going to be like some fundamental wall in physics that we cannot get past. It seems like we just need to keep going, and we will get there.
Do you think that there's particular... Okay, so you mentioned plastination. At least that's what I think you're referring to. Do you think that's the state of art in cryopreservation today, or brain preservation today? Or would you suggest that it's something else? Or yeah. And what
Plastic,
about in the future? Do you think
yeah.
where the state of the art plastination techniques that we have today are the best that they'll ever be?
So correct me if I'm wrong. I think plastination refers to room temperature preservation techniques.
Correct.
Yeah, I don't really know where they stand. So you got two things. You've got the cryopreservation, and then there is the preparation of a brain sample for slicing, which is not cryo. Like, it's just room temperature. And it's a resin. I don't really know what the chemical structure is, but it's essentially you flush out a lot of colorful and opaque things so that you can physically see through the brain. And once you've flushed all that stuff out, you embed it in some kind of resin. I'm not a chemist, I don't know. And now you've got like this solid block with a transparent brain inside it. Then you slice that and you take pictures of it. Now, preservation, especially sort of preservation for the purpose of longevity, sort of cryonics or the next generation of cryonic-like preservation, which would be these sort of the aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation that the Brain Preservation Foundation has awarded, which is probably, definitely the next sort of generation in preservation if we can get it sort of normalized, popularized. That's for a different task. That's for the task of preserving people, keeping them alive, for one of two reasons. Many proponents of sort of classic cryonics want to be kept alive just to sort of get to that point in the future where the technology can revive them biologically again. The other reason to go into preservation of some form, though, is to just get to that point in the future, not where you can be biologically revived, but where mind uploading technology has gotten to the point where it can upload your preserved brain, and you would not come back biologically, you would come back as an upload. Now, I don't want to completely distract. We can get into why would you want one? Why would you want the other? What's the benefit? Why would you choose one if the other's available? There's a whole conversation there, but I think it would sort of take us off into the weeds. But there's this issue of preservation for longevity, and there's this issue of preserving and preparing a brain sample for very contemporary and real, sort of slicing and scanning that we do today in labs today all over the world.
What about inspirations from biology? And it's been mentioned before about the visual cortex, how that's very much like the way a convolutional neural network might work. There's hierarchies there. They've got logical receptive fields and shared weights. Do you think this is important to sort of mimic the way that biology works in the way that we approach developing a whole brain emulation, or can it be a completely wildly different computing paradigm?
Yeah. Modern convolutional neural networks were intentionally inspired by the visual cortex. It's actually not that brains resemble convolutional neural nets.
Yeah, sure.
Convolutional neural nets were sort of built on the previous 4 decades of research into how vision works. We've actually learned a whole lot about how vision works. And we said, wait a minute, what if we code that up in a computer and see if it can see? And lo and behold, it's actually worked incredibly well. So one thing that story tells is that biomimicry is a very good strategy. If you figure out how nature does something and then emulate that with engineering, that's very likely to actually get you pretty far down the road toward whatever task you're trying to solve. For whole brain emulation, there's an interesting opportunity to cut some really major corners at the possible expense of like a major philosophical or metaphysical failure. So, what do I mean by that? At the lowest level, we could create a whole brain emulation of neurons and synapses, individually firing action potentials down their axons, across the synapses, into the dendrites, through the full complex web of neurons. And we would expect that to certainly be functionally successful. There's a whole big debate about whether it's successful in some other way, but it's, because some people think it has to be a biological system to be conscious, or it has to be whatever, but it would functionally replicate the action potential propagation paradigm. But that's actually pretty computationally inefficient. Why recreate 1,000 neurons that fire in some complex arrangement to perform multiplication if you can just stick a multiplication module in there that has the same black box behavior of the neurons? Right? If you've got a set of neurons, and you send input signals in and you read the output signals out, you could replace that set of neurons with what we call a black box. Ted Berger has been doing this with the hypothalamus. And if you basically produce a prosthesis, effectively, that takes in neural signals and emits neural signals like the system that it's replacing, the set of neurons it's replacing, you could use a potentially much simpler computational piece of hardware to process those signals and yet get the same functional propagation, right? So it's an interesting question how far that could go. How much of the brain could we abstract away to some algorithm? One of the biggest ones would be like cortical columns. The cortical columns are these sets of about 100 neurons that seem to sort of process kind of as a singular unit. We don't really know exactly what they're doing or how they're doing it, but there's this repeated cortical column pattern. If we could solve the cortical column algorithm, we might just black box the whole thing away. What if you could just make a single computer chip that emulates, the hundreds of neurons and the thousands upon thousands of synapses in a single cortical column? Just turn the whole thing into some little computer that may not work the same way at all, but it will take the same neural signals and it will emit the same signals. So it has perfectly replaced that behavior, but in a completely different way, right? And then the question is, well, what if you did that with every cortical column in the entire brain? So a whole lot of the neural structure that we consider to be extremely human in its architecture would be completely replaced with some sort of computational abstraction. The same signals would be going through, but would it actually metaphysically be the same sort of mind? And we don't know. We don't know where that cutoff is, where the sort of level of fidelity of your emulation loses some sort of metaphysical thing that is deemed important. We don't know where that threshold is. I suspect that we might find it, because as you produce these things, as you produce these prostheses, these modules, and emulate them, if you get some sort of surprising behavior out of it, then you're probably abstracting too far. I'm not sure how that would happen, because if it's reproducing the same functions, there isn't an opportunity for it to sort of behave differently. That's the whole point of the functional paradigm. So I'm not really sure where it could break down. But if it was going to break down, presumably we would discover it. Otherwise you're just back into philosophical zombie territory. You'd be able to replicate all the functionality, but you wouldn't know that you've. But then I just find that all very hard to buy.
Yeah. What do you think? Look, there's the issue of like the fire in the equations when like Hawking spoke about like what is understanding of a mathematical formula, what is the what's the important difference between the way computers at the time when he wrote this subject would be able to calculate and the way a human would be able to calculate, and he spoke about fire in the equations. I think it was Hawking anyway. Maybe it's got something to do with like something like that, an embodied understanding, maybe a feeling. I don't know, a valence of it.
It's going to be one of the big questions of neuroscience in the coming decades.
Sure. Well, okay. Another big question that I thought to bring up was, why is a form of whole brain emulation of your preserved brain, probably you, and you've written directly about this, but I thought I might bring this up during the interview. Why do you think a whole brain emulation of Keith Wiley would be Keith Wiley, even if the original was still alive?
Well, that last sentence really
okay.
That's where people start the big debates, right?
Well, let's step back. Let's exclude that last sentence then, because we will touch on identity branching.
Yeah.
But
I mean, that has been the bulk of my writing, is defending the branching interpretation. But yeah, why would it be me? So there are different theories of metaphysical personal identity. For example, you have the body theory, which basically says that your identity is attached to the matter that you're built out of. You have a stream of consciousness theory, which is that it's some sort of continual stream of consciousness. You have the space-time worm identity, which is that this thing that sort of weaves its way through four-dimensional space-time because it's sort of continuously located sort of in a smooth path. The identity is sort of following this sort of worm through time, but it doesn't discontinuously jump around. And then you have psychological identity. There are others. There's closest continuor identity. Closest continuor identity says that the thing that is you now is that which most closely resembles the thing that was you, very recently. And you have to get into the thought experiments to sort of figure out sort of where that question comes up. But another theory is psychological identity, which is a catch-all term for, by psychological, what we mean is the memories. Your identity is indicated by your psychological traits, your personality traits, your memories, all the sort of cognitive, emotional, intellectual sort of senses of who you are. That's your identity. Every single one of these theories can be subjected to sort of colorful thought experiments that try to sort of break them apart and undo them and find some sort of paradox that unweaves them. And the interesting thing about the psychological theory is that it only breaks down if you declare at the outset that you're going to reject branching interpretations. So you basically have to say, well, branching is just going to cause a lot of trouble for my thought experiments, so I'm just going to say it's excluded and we're not allowed to consider it. And if you say that, then you can come up with a thought experiment where psychological identity sort of runs into problems, the same way all the other identity problems models can run into problems. But if you don't cut yourself off at the knees at the beginning, if you say, well, wait a minute, branching identity is on the table, let's see where that takes us, then psychological identity is the most robust theory that I have yet found.
Well, okay, so you're going to be talking a lot about this in your up-and-coming novel, Contemplating Oblivion. So anybody who's interested in these topics would like to explore worlds in which they are covered, watch this space, or watch out for Contemplating Oblivion. So, but yeah, do you want to just give us a breakdown of some of the writings you've covered identity branching in? It's your favorite topic. It's what you've covered the most.
Yeah. So it all started slightly before my 2014 book. I was inspired to write an article in which I sort of thought I would lay out my basic sort of theory of branching identity in early 2014. I'm sort of going through my own list of writing here to sort of guide myself.
Yeah. Was this the H Plus magazine?
let me think here. It was in March of 2014. It was actually a response to a article by Susan Schneider.
Yeah,
Um,
I remember.
yes, and I wrote an article for H plus. Yes.
I think you might
Um,
have emailed me about that and got me to put that in there when I was on the
right.
board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the date. So if that was March 2014, that means that I basically wrote that article and then I must have come off of that article with
Mm.
ideas for a book just boiling because I started it immediately. I worked on the book that summer of 2014. So the larger work I produced is my book, A Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading.
Mm.
Um, and then from there, I just continued to write. So I produced a paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies with Randall Cohen, which tackles one very specific question, which is, uh, you know, I've been talking about the slicing and scanning approach to whole brain emulation. Another thought experiment or scenario that comes up in a lot of philosophical musing is what we call gradual replacement, where you perfuse the brain with billions of nanobot prosthetic neurons of some sort, and they learn the input-output function of the neurons, and then once they've got that function figured out, they kill the neuron and like attach to all of its synapses, and slowly over time the whole brain becomes mechanical. Um, I think it's all complete and total nonsense. It's a fun thought experiment. It makes maybe potentially good science fiction. I don't know, but it's not practical. You know, it's it's very sobering to read sort of online debates about the stuff in which people, with great emotional commitment, say that they really require like a gradual replacement process in order to be uploaded. Well, I got news for you. It's not going to happen. That is so technically challenging that I don't know if we'll have it in 1,000 years. It is beyond incomprehensibly challenging. Whereas scanning slices of preserved brains is a 20th century tech. We're doing it now. So we're talking about the trade-offs between a technology that exists now and a technology that I'm not sure if it will exist in 1,000 years. That is the chasm between these two approaches. So Randall and I wrote a paper that argues not only, is gradual replacement just, technically just bonkers, but from a philosophical standpoint, we don't have to worry about it. It doesn't matter. It actually isn't a critical need anyway. The whole point of the paper is to argue that metaphysically and interpretively, both of these two procedures have the same outcome from sort of the perspective of personal identity. So we don't have to worry about the impossible gradual replacement process. The scanning of a preserved brain will work just fine. So that paper was in JOCS. I've written several others. I wrote sort of an all-encompassing paper that was sort of a broad sort of life philosophy paper with the tongue-in-cheek title of Mind Uploading in the Question of Life, the Universe, and Everything, obviously an homage to Douglas Adams. And the thrust of that paper is sort of a step-by-step, almost theorem-like layout of an argument that argues that developing mind uploading is the most important priority ever. It is the most important thing for us to work on. And the reason why it is the most important thing is the entire sort of line of reasoning laid out in the paper. One might immediately sort of knee-jerk response to that. Well, that's just ridiculous. How can that guy possibly say that? Well, read the paper. The whole point of the paper is to explain why I think that's so critically important. And then I've written two papers that get into this argument that a breakage in the stream of consciousness implies a death and then some sort of invoked doppelganger in the upload. I found that such an important topic that I actually ended up writing two papers on it. I don't know. I probably have others too, but yeah, I sort of keep writing about it.
Hmm. Well, I mean, do you think, how do you think people will react? I mean, when push comes to shove, do people really care if there's a doppelganger or if what they feel is a doppelganger out there? Do they mind if there's two identities that are metaphysically exactly the same, at least on invocation?
Well,
I
that's
think a
not
lot
the.
of people are uncomfortable with this idea.
I don't know if the concern is whether there's either one or two of them. The concern is that by being some sort of a copy, it represents that they actually died. They didn't really survive the procedure. They died. The entire goal of surviving through the procedure into the upload failed, and the person living on as the upload is just some other person. Um, and therefore, the entire goal of using this procedure as a method of survival has failed. So that's the concern. Um, that's why people sort of get very knotted up about whether or not it's a copy.
Hmm. Okay. Well, was there any interesting points that you wanted to? There was a recent meeting you had, like I guess Is there
Yeah,
anything that you discussed at this meeting, at the whole brain emulation meeting with Anders Sandberg, Randall
Robin
Kuhner,
Hanson.
and yourself and others? Robin Hanson was
Yeah.
there. Yeah. Is there
Um,
any
so the
points that you brought up that you thought you might be able to reveal?
well, okay. So the topic of that meeting, just for the audience, the topic was the ethics surrounding whole brain emulation. So it got into several different questions. It got into I'm just sort of reading over the notes here. The future of work. What will it mean? What will work mean when to do work consists of spinning off a whole brain emulation and having it do the work and then shutting down the emulation when the work is done. What does that say about people
Mm,
are always concerned about technology taking jobs. So if we're just spinning off WVEs, whole brain emulations, then how are we ever going to get a paycheck ever again? But then if whole brain emulations are really sort of verging on conscious human minds, there's a whole other question about work, which is, are we making an entire society of slaves, right? So that came up. Um, then we talked about just sort of good old-fashioned existential risk. It's a topic that always comes up everywhere. I don't actually remember exactly where the conversation went. I don't tend to have like a crystal clear
mm.
immediate short-term memory. I'm the kind of person who has to look at the notes afterwards to remember, and I don't have the notes
Yeah,
from it in
yeah.
front of me. But I can go through the topics. We talked about an interesting one was once whole brain emulation is sort of common, what are the implications in terms of neurosecurity and mental privacy? So this is a concern not for us, but a concern for the well-being of whole brain emulations. What rights should they have to the security of their brains and minds against hacking? And what rights do they have to privacy? Once a whole brain emulation can probably be interrogated more easily, so it'll basically
Mm.
be more difficult for it to lie. Does it have the right to lie? We talk about access and inequality, democratization of the technology. This is just sort of a very common concern that the rich elites will not only get it first, but will get it first and then somehow lock it down so that instead of just coming along 10 years later at the scale of sort of technological advancement, somehow everyone else will get sort of blocked out. We talked about sort of the ethics of using animals for research and development, and then what the implications are for using increasingly verisimilitudinous emulations in sort of in lieu of animals. If there's an ethics question about using an animal in an experiment, is there an ethics question about using a really, really good emulation of an animal? I mean, so good that the emulation might be conscious. What sort of ethical concerns are there about using a system like that experimentally? Once we get into population ethics and emulations, I'm not even sure what that refers to. Um, yeah, I don't know. We talked about a lot of stuff, but it was all sort of from an ethical perspective. That was the point of that panel.
Yeah. So I mean, this probably comes up for a lot of people. So as futurists with some sort of idea of how mind uploading might work, we might be concerned about friends or family who have a short time to live, and the the difficulty in discussing this with people who have not got an interest in futurology. But have you got any advice on how to speak to people about the possibility of survival beyond the flesh?
I sort of find myself having this conversation a lot. I'm just sort of, telling people about my book, and I have to, break through that initial barrier of people just sort of having to sort of an initial shock that my book is about what? That's ridiculous. So I have that conversation a lot. Um, People are actually generally receptive to the idea of it. I'm sure there's an entire population contingent that just sort of has this very powerful religious objection, and I just, don't tend to cross paths with this with people in my life. But people are just sort of broadly, sort of curious about technology, but maybe they don't make it their entire daily life, and sort of think about these things. But most of their exposure is through rather poorly written science fiction, mostly. Written science fiction is often pretty good. Hollywood is generally terrible. So, if your exposure to these ideas is mostly movies coming out of Hollywood, then you're probably, not getting the richest philosophical presentation of the ideas. So, what do? I talk to people about it. I just try to sort of not be overly prescriptive, sort of telling people sort of what I think they ought to believe. It's more a question of whether or not this ought to be available as an option for people who would choose it without putting some sort of prohibition against it. And then people who are uncomfortable with it, they don't have to do it. I mean, nobody's forcing them. But, sort of try to convince people that it's just a typical sort of let's let people make decisions for their own sake kind of issue. If you can get there, then that's usually a pretty good conversation. I think people are sort of resistant. People are always trying to figure out whether or not the government needs to prohibit something. I'm not entirely sure why, but it seems to be something people worry about a lot. So I think they may just have to evolve through a few generations. With each passing generation, they don't have to actually shed their prior sort of biases from childhood because they're just sort of born into an increasingly technological world. They will be born into a world of increasingly sort of versatile AI systems with which they interact. Their teddy bears are going to be increasingly lifelike with each passing generation. And by the time anything even vaguely resembling whole brain emulation is possible, that generation will have been interacting with computers that are so smart that they will already seem lifelike anyway. And the whole concept's just going to be relatively comfortable to that future generation. We just, I don't know. I don't really worry too much about our generation because it's not going to happen in our time anyway. We just need to keep the research money flowing. So long as there isn't a general sort of hatred of science, then we're doing okay.
Do you think cryopreservation for yourself is an option to reach for yourself to reach a time in which whole brain emulation is possible?
So the Brain Preservation Foundation has multiple sort of goals. One is to sort of advance the actual technology of preservation to sort of actually get the thing available, make it technically possible. But then there's this sort of advocacy component of, how can this procedure become part of sort of run-of-the-mill society, just a general procedure available in hospitals or something like that. I think those gears turn pretty slowly. That's a lot of politics. It's a lot of red tape and just sort of a lot of regulation. I tend to be pretty tempered about this stuff. Other people just get really excited about it. They think everything's going to happen in 20 years, and I don't know if I'm cynical or just sort of realistic. I would be absolutely amazed if the technology of human brain preservation was cheap enough and available enough to serve me. But maybe if something happens very rapidly in the next few decades, then maybe. But I don't know. But we're probably only missing it by one or two generations. It's pretty sad to think that we might be one of the last generations ever that sort of has to contend with this. But I mean, I don't know, it's more exciting than missing it by 1,000 years. I mean, at least we get to sort of understand it, right? 1,000 years ago, no one even understood any of this. So that's good enough. It'll have to be.
Well, who knows? I mean, like if we get AI-powered scientists, and there's some claim that could really fast forward a lot of the science. Maybe there's a chance. I don't know.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there's a lot of written science fiction which you are more, I guess, amenable to, which gives better descriptions of how whole brain emulations might work. What science fiction is that? What's been your favorite?
So a few years ago, I sort of sent myself on a mind uploading voyage trying to find, all the good sci-fi on it. Of course, I'm sure I missed, 90% of it. But Greg Egan's Permutation City is famous. Yeah. Arthur C. Clarke's City in the Stars. Altered Carbon, which of course was a Netflix hit. There were others because I had I had at least 5 of these books I sort of rattled through, so I'm missing a few. But it's definitely a topic that's been presented and covered pretty well in some cases.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, yes. Is there any points that you wanted to talk about that I haven't yet asked you that you thought might be worth bringing up?
Well, I think you and I will talk about my upcoming book in another session, so I'll leave that to then. So yeah, it was nice to have an opportunity to sort of talk about these ideas again. It's been a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has. Thanks very much, Keith. It's really good to talk to you again, and I look forward to our conversation about your up and coming book, Contemplating Oblivion.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Cheers.